For almost 18 years, one man in our office ate lunch alone. Always the same table. Always the same time. Always the same homemade sandwich packed in a faded blue lunchbox. Nobody sat with him. Nobody invited him anywhere. And strangely, nobody treated him badly either. There were no jokes, no gossip, no office rumors. People simply left him alone. Whenever a new employee asked why, someone always gave the exact same answer. Just let Frank have his lunch, nothing more. At first, I assumed he wanted privacy. Some people do. Then I noticed something strange. Even when the cafeteria was completely full, the chair across from him always stayed empty. Not because there weren't any seats. People would rather stand by the vending machines than sit across from Frank. One afternoon, I watched an intern carry his tray toward that table. Before he could sit down, another employee quietly stopped him. Not that one. The intern looked confused. Why? Just trust me. He picked another table without asking another question. Frank never reacted. He simply continued eating as if none of it had happened. That made me even more curious. My name is Daniel Brooks. I was 32 years old and had only worked at Harper Financial for 3 months. Everything still felt new. New desk, new coworkers, new routines. Frank was part of those routines. Every weekday at exactly 12 o'clock, he walked into the cafeteria, carrying the same blue lunchbox. Turkey sandwich, apple, small bag of pretzels, black coffee. Nothing ever changed. He sat at the table beside the window, opened his lunchbox, folded a white napkin onto the table, and ate in complete silence. At exactly 12:45, he packed everything away, wiped the table with the napkin, threw it in the trash, and went back upstairs. Every single day. One Friday, I asked my teammate Melissa about him. Why does everyone avoid Frank? She didn't even look up from her computer. We don't avoid him. It kind of looks like you do, she sighed. Just leave him alone. Why? It's easier. Easier for who? She finally looked at me. For everyone. That wasn't an answer. If anything, it only made me more interested. The following week, I tried asking someone else. Robert from accounting had worked there almost 20 years. Surely he'd know. He smiled politely, then shook his head. You'll understand eventually. I'd rather understand now. You won't. That irritated me. Nobody seemed afraid of Frank. Nobody disliked him. In fact, every time he passed through the office, people smiled at him. They asked about his weekend, held elevators for him, brought him coffee if they were already making one. Everyone liked him. Just not at lunch. That contradiction stayed in my mind for days. Then Tuesday came. The cafeteria was unusually crowded. A company seminar had brought in visitors from another branch. Every table filled within minutes, except Frank's. He sat alone beside the window exactly as always. Meanwhile, people wandered around balancing trays, searching desperately for somewhere to sit. One visitor even asked, "Is this seat taken?" She pointed directly across from Frank. Before he could answer, Melissa stepped in. I wouldn't. The visitor blinked. Why not? Melissa hesitated. It's reserved. Reserved. Frank was sitting alone. There was no coat on the chair, no food tray, no bag, nothing. The visitor looked confused, but walked away anyway. Frank quietly thanked Melissa. She smiled. No problem. That was the moment something stopped making sense. If Frank wanted to eat alone, why would he thank someone for keeping another chair empty? Later that afternoon, I passed his office. Unlike everyone else's workspace, his desk held almost nothing. No family photos, no decorations, no awards, just a calendar and a small wooden picture frame, turned face down. Not displayed, hidden. For some reason, that bothered me more than anything else. The next morning I arrived early. Frank was already there. He smiled as I walked past. Morning, Daniel. Morning. Friendly, completely normal. Nothing mysterious about him. Around 11:55, I watched him stand up. He picked up the familiar blue lunchbox, straightened his tie, and headed toward the cafeteria. For reasons I couldn't explain, I stood up too. Melissa noticed immediately. What are you doing? I'm having lunch. She looked toward Frank, then back at me. No. What do you mean, no? Don't. Why? She lowered her voice. Please. I just want to sit with him. She stared at me for several seconds, then quietly said, You're the first person who's tried. In a very long time. I looked toward the cafeteria doors, where Frank had already disappeared inside. Then I picked up my tray. Whatever everyone else believed, I was tired of mysteries. If a man had spent 18 years eating lunch alone, someone should at least ask if he wanted company. So I walked toward the table by the window. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, someone pulled out the empty chair across from Frank. I carried my tray across the cafeteria. Every conversation around me seemed to get quieter with each step, not because people were watching openly, because they were pretending not to. Frank looked up as I stopped beside his table. Mind if I sit here? For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely surprised. He glanced at the empty chair across from him, then back at me. Finally, he smiled. Of course. I was beginning to think nobody remembered that chair was actually for sitting. I laughed. So was I. I pulled it out and sat down. Behind me, I could almost feel the entire cafeteria staring. Frank unwrapped his sandwich. So, Daniel, right? That's me. How are you settling in? It wasn't awkward. In fact, it was probably the most normal lunch conversation I'd had since joining the company. We talked about work, about the weather, about baseball. He asked where I'd grown up. I asked how long he'd worked here. 18 years. Same department? He smiled. 3 promotions. Same building. Same cafeteria. I couldn't help smiling. Same sandwich? He looked down at his lunch. Almost. My doctor finally convinced me to stop eating potato chips. I laughed. I guess pretzels won. They did. For nearly 40 minutes we talked like 2 ordinary coworkers. Nothing strange. Nothing uncomfortable. Every now and then another employee walked past our table. Almost every one of them looked surprised. A few even smiled. One quietly nodded toward Frank before continuing on. Frank greeted every single person by name. He seemed to know everyone. The janitors, the interns, the executives. When the company president walked through the cafeteria, he even stopped. Frank, good to see you. You too, Mark. They shook hands like old friends. As soon as he walked away, I couldn't help asking, The CEO knows you pretty well. Frank shrugged. I've been here longer than he has. That explained it. Or at least part of it. At exactly 12:45, Frank folded his napkin, packed away his lunchbox, finished the last sip of coffee, then stood up. Same time tomorrow? The question caught me off guard. You mean, you don't mind? He smiled warmly. Daniel, I've been eating lunch alone for a long time. It's nice having someone to talk to. I nodded. I'll be here. He extended his hand. It felt oddly formal for 2 people who had just shared sandwiches. I'm glad you sat down. So am I. Frank walked toward the elevators, carrying the faded blue lunchbox under one arm. I remained at the table for another minute, trying to understand why everyone had acted as though sitting with him was such a terrible idea. Nothing had happened. He wasn't rude. He wasn't strange. If anything, he was one of the easiest people I'd ever talked to. As I threw away my tray, Melissa intercepted me. How was it? Honestly, she nodded. Great. I don't get it. She studied my face carefully. He talked to you? For almost 45 minutes. And what? She looked genuinely relieved. I was afraid. She stopped herself. Afraid of what? She forced a smile. Never mind. Back upstairs, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The mystery had only grown deeper. Everyone behaved as though Frank's lunch routine was sacred. Yet Frank himself seemed genuinely happy that someone had finally joined him. Late that afternoon, I passed his office again. This time, his door was open. He was humming quietly while organizing paperwork. When he noticed me, he smiled. See you tomorrow. Absolutely. He gave a small wave, then returned to his work. As I walked away, I glanced inside one last time. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the corner of his desk sat tomorrow's lunch, the same faded blue lunchbox, already packed. Beside it were 2 neatly folded white napkins. Not 1, 2. I stared at them for several seconds. At lunch, he had only used one. So why had he packed two for tomorrow? I almost went back to ask. Instead, I kept walking. For the first time since meeting Frank, I realized the mystery had never been about why he ate alone. It was about who the second napkin had always been for. The next morning, I arrived at work a little earlier than usual. Not because I had to. Because I couldn't stop thinking about the second napkin. It was such a small detail, yet it refused to leave my mind. When lunchtime finally came, I walked into the cafeteria expecting to see Frank already sitting at his usual table. He was. Same chair, same blue lunchbox, same quiet smile, and two neatly folded napkins. He looked up as I approached. Right on time. I didn't want you to think I'd changed my mind. I was hoping you hadn't. I sat down. This time the cafeteria barely reacted. A few people looked over. Most didn't. Apparently the surprise had worn off. Frank handed me one of the napkins before I even opened my tray. I figured you'd forget again. I looked at him. You packed that for me? He smiled. I packed it yesterday. I couldn't help asking. So that's what the second napkin was for. You noticed. It was hard not to. He laughed quietly. I've packed two every morning for 18 years. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. 18 years, he nodded. Every single workday. But, I hesitated. Why? He carefully unfolded his own napkin before answering. Because someone used to sit here. The cafeteria suddenly seemed much quieter. My wife. I didn't interrupt. Her name was Emily. She worked upstairs in accounting. We started eating lunch together during my first week here. He smiled at the memory. I always forgot napkins. So she'd bring two. After we got married, I started bringing them. I looked down at the extra napkin in my hand. We ate lunch together almost every day. For 14 years. What happened? Frank stared toward the windows. She got sick. The smile disappeared. Cancer. She kept working for as long as she could. Even when she was exhausted, she'd still come downstairs. Just for 30 minutes. He paused. She said lunch made the day feel normal. I didn't know what to say. So after she passed away, you kept bringing two. He nodded once. At first, I forgot to stop. Then after a while, I realized I didn't want to. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally I asked, is that why you've always sat alone? Frank shook his head. No. I never asked anyone not to join me. People just assumed I wanted to be left alone. They saw me sitting here after Emily died. They gave me space. The next week, they did it again. Eventually, it became a habit. 18 years passed before someone finally asked if this seat was taken. I felt a knot form in my stomach. All those years, everyone believed they were respecting him. No one had ever actually asked what he wanted. I wasn't waiting to be alone. Frank said quietly. I was waiting for someone brave enough to ignore the rumors. I looked around the cafeteria. For the first time, I noticed people watching us differently. Not with curiosity, with guilt. Several employees quickly looked away when our eyes met, almost as though they suddenly understood the mistake they'd all been making. As we finished eating, a woman carrying a coffee paused beside our table. She looked to be in her late 50s, gray streaks in her hair, employee badge clipped to her sweater. She smiled at Frank. I've been meaning to do this for years. Before either of us could respond, she pulled out the empty chair beside our table. Mind if I join you tomorrow? Frank looked at her for several seconds, then smiled wider than I had ever seen. I'd like that very much. As she walked away, I noticed something else. People throughout the cafeteria had stopped avoiding Frank's table. Instead, they were looking at the empty chairs around it. Almost as if, for the first time in 18 years, they realized they had never really been reserved at all. The next day, something happened that none of us expected. When Frank and I walked into the cafeteria together, someone was already sitting at our table. It was Linda, the woman who had asked if she could join us. She looked almost nervous. I hope I wasn't too early. Frank smiled. I've been early for 18 years. She laughed. I guess now it's my turn. The three of us ate together. At first, the conversation stayed simple. Weekend plans, traffic, The terrible office coffee. But after a while, Linda looked at Frank and quietly said, "I owe you an apology." Frank tilted his head. "For what?" "I worked on the same floor as Emily." He froze. "I remember." Linda looked down at her coffee. "When she passed away, I wanted to sit with you. So why didn't you?" "Because everyone kept saying you needed privacy." "I believed them." She shook her head. "I've regretted it ever since." Frank didn't answer immediately. Finally, he smiled. "We were all doing the best we knew how." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I should have asked instead of assuming." Frank reached across the table and gently touched her hand. So did everyone else. For the first time since I'd met him, I realized there wasn't a trace of bitterness in his voice. Only acceptance. Over the next week, something quietly began changing throughout the office. Nobody announced it. Nobody organized it. It simply happened. One day, another coworker asked if they could join us. The next day, 2 more chairs filled. Then someone started bringing homemade cookies. Another person brought extra fruit. People who had worked in the same building for years suddenly began learning things about each other they had somehow never discussed. The lonely table in the corner slowly became the busiest table in the cafeteria. Ironically, Frank spoke less than anyone. He mostly listened, asked questions, remembered names, remembered birthdays, remembered whose daughter had just started college, whose father was recovering from surgery, whose son had gotten his driver's license. It amazed me. The quiet man everyone assumed kept to himself, remembered more about everyone else than anyone in the office. One afternoon, I asked him about it while we were walking back upstairs. "How do you remember all that?" He shrugged. "When you spend years eating alone, you end up listening. I heard conversations from every table. I just don't think people realized." I laughed. "So you've known everything happening around here for years?" "Pretty much." "And nobody knew anything about you?" "No." "Did that ever bother you?" He thought about it. "Sometimes. But after a while, being invisible becomes comfortable." That sentence stayed with me. Being invisible becomes comfortable. Not because people enjoy it, because eventually, they stop believing anyone notices they're there. A few days later, I was helping Human Resources prepare for the company's anniversary celebration. Old photographs from previous decades were spread across a conference table. Someone had scanned hundreds of pictures from company picnics, holiday parties, and retirement dinners. As we sorted them into albums, I noticed Frank in nearly every year. Always standing toward the edge, always smiling politely. Rarely beside anyone except Emily. Then I found one photograph from almost 20 years earlier. It showed the annual summer picnic, employees laughing around long tables in the park, children playing nearby, and in the middle of the picture, Frank and Emily. She was laughing so hard she'd nearly spilled her lemonade. Frank was looking at her instead of the camera. The expression on his face caught me completely off guard. I'd never seen someone look at another person with so much warmth. One of the older HR managers noticed the photo in my hand. They were everybody's favorite couple. I looked up. "Really?" "Oh, absolutely." They organized birthday collections, visited sick coworkers, brought meals when someone had surgery. She smiled at the picture. If someone had a bad day, Emily somehow always found out. And Frank made sure they weren't alone at lunch. I stared at the photograph again. The irony almost hurt. The man who had spent 18 years eating by himself had once been the person who made sure nobody else ever had to. A week later, our department manager announced that Frank would be retiring at the end of the month. The room fell unusually quiet. I looked toward Frank. He simply nodded. No speech. No dramatic announcement. Just a quiet smile. After the meeting, I caught up with him in the hallway. "You never told me. I only found out yesterday." "You've really decided?" "I think it's time." "For what?" He looked toward the windows overlooking the parking lot. "For something I should have done years ago." That afternoon we ate lunch together again. Only this time, almost a dozen people joined us. Halfway through the meal, someone asked the obvious question. "What are you going to do after retirement?" Frank smiled. I honestly don't know. No plans? Not really. You must have something. He stirred his soup for a few seconds. Emily always wanted us to travel. She collected brochures, national parks, small coastal towns, train routes. He laughed softly. We never went. Work, bills, life. I kept telling her we had time. Nobody interrupted. Finally, he looked around the table. I've decided to stop saying that. What? We have time. His voice remained calm. Sometimes we don't. A few days later, I arrived early for work and found Frank standing beside the office bulletin board. He was pinning up a small photograph. Emily. The same picture from his desk. Underneath it, he'd written one sentence. In loving memory of Emily Carter, whose kindness made this office feel like home. Nothing else. No long explanation. No dates. Just that. When people began arriving, something unexpected happened. One by one, they stopped. Read the note. Then quietly added something beside it. A sticky note. A memory. She brought me soup when I had pneumonia. She stayed late to help me finish my first project. She remembered my daughter's birthday every year. Within 2 days, the entire bulletin board had filled with handwritten memories. Dozens of them. Some from people who had left the company years earlier after hearing about it. Frank stood in front of the board for a long time. He didn't cry. He simply read every single note. Slowly, carefully, as though meeting Emily all over again through everyone else's memories. The following Friday, our department held a retirement lunch for Frank. Nothing expensive, just sandwiches, cake, and too much coffee. The conference room was completely full. People from other departments showed up. Former employees came back. Even the CEO attended. During the speeches, everyone talked about Frank's reliability, his patience, his professionalism. Then the CEO paused. I need to admit something. The room became quiet. I've worked in this building for 23 years. I saw Frank eat lunch alone almost every day. He looked toward Frank. I told myself you probably preferred it. I never actually asked. He shook his head. I should have. Several people lowered their eyes, because they had thought exactly the same thing. I had too. The difference was, one day I'd finally asked. When it was Frank's turn to speak, he stood slowly and looked around the room. I've never liked giving speeches. That made everyone laugh. He held up the small photograph of Emily. For a long time, I thought sitting alone helped me keep her close. He smiled gently. But I was wrong. He looked around the room again. The thing Emily loved most was people. She would have hated seeing me eat alone for 18 years. A few people laughed through tears, including me. Frank nodded toward our table. I'm grateful someone finally ignored my routine. Then he looked directly at me. Thank you for sitting down. I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Because I realized something. I hadn't changed Frank's life that day. I'd simply given him permission to come back into everyone else's. A month after Frank retired, I realized something had changed. Not just for him, for all of us. The cafeteria no longer had an empty table. People mixed. Departments that barely spoke before now ate together. New employees were almost immediately invited to join someone. Nobody had planned it. The culture had simply shifted, because one quiet habit had finally been broken. About 6 weeks later, I received a postcard. The front showed a lighthouse overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. On the back, in Frank's neat handwriting, were only a few sentences. Emily always wanted to see this place. I finally made it. You were right. Lunch tastes better when someone is sitting beside you. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Over the following year, another postcard arrived every month. Yellowstone, Maine, the Smoky Mountains, a tiny bookstore in Vermont, a train station in Colorado. None of the messages were long, just little moments. Emily would have loved the wildflowers here. I finally learned how to fish. Met a retired teacher who reminded me of you. Still terrible at reading maps. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Frank wasn't surviving. He was living again. Almost a year after his retirement, our company held its annual summer picnic. The same park where that old photograph of Frank and Emily had been taken years before. Someone suggested recreating it. We stood in almost the same spot. Same trees, same picnic tables, different people. One chair remained empty. Someone quietly placed Emily's framed photograph there. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. When the picture was taken, every person naturally turned toward the empty chair and smiled. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was Frank. "I've got something for you." When I found him near the edge of the park, he handed me a small wooden box. Inside was the old chess knight that had always sat on his desk. "The missing piece?" I asked. He nodded. "I found it while packing. The other knight had fallen behind a drawer years ago." I laughed. "So now the set is complete." Frank smiled. "I kept thinking about that. Funny how one missing piece can make something feel unfinished." He closed the lid and pushed the box back toward me. "I'd like you to have it." "I can't." "I insist." "Why?" He looked across the park where our coworkers were laughing together. "Because you reminded me that life isn't meant to be lived waiting for someone who isn't coming back. You don't stop loving them. You just stop living only in yesterday." Sometimes people ask why I sat beside the quiet man who always ate alone. The truth is, there wasn't a reason. Every chair at the other tables happened to be full. His was empty. I simply asked, "Mind if I sit here?" Looking back, it's strange how the smallest decisions can quietly change someone's life. Not through grand speeches, not through dramatic gestures, just by choosing not to let another person eat alone. Whenever I visit the office now, I still walk through the cafeteria. The corner table is never empty anymore. Someone is always sitting there, usually with someone new. And every time I see it, I think about Frank. Because 18 years of loneliness didn't end with therapy, or money, or time. It ended with 4 simple words. "Mind if I sit?"